Chapter 26. The Hard Problem of Consciousness. Consciousness cannot be accounted for in physical terms, for consciousness is absolutely fundamental. It cannot be accounted for in terms of anything else. Erwin Schrödinger. Agnostic physicists have long been troubled about the apparent connection between wave function and consciousness. After all, as was seen in the double-slit and delayed choice quantum eraser experiments, if any information was observed, even indirectly, the wave of probabilities collapses into what we call particles. Cue the woo-woo alarm for the science commentators. They have pounced on the notion with a particular vehemence only befitting extreme cognitive dissonance. Read articles from them, and you will hear them call the potential role of consciousness wild, irrelevant, or fringe speculation. As with most of their objections to anything woo-woo, they beg the question by the ambiguity of their technical jargon and choosing meanings that conveniently fit their paradigms. In other words, they adorn their academic cloaks and hide. Underneath, they fear that the universe can no longer be reduced to quantity, as we have seen in the measurement problem. Now, quality has entered the picture, and with it, consciousness. The universe is at its bottom, quality, appearance, or idea. As the 2020 movie The End of Quantum Reality mentions, physicists have lost their grip on reality and are displeased by their humiliation. I will adapt the thought experiment by the philosopher Frank Jackson, 1986, commonly known as Mary's Room, to illustrate. Suppose there is a woman also named Mary who is a brilliant ophthalmologist. She has studied all there is to know about the physics, psychology, and neurology of color vision, but unfortunately was born with achromatopsia. This condition lets her only see in black, white, or shades of gray. We suppose this was her motivation to learn so much about color in the first place. Nonetheless, Mary was intrigued by the neurophysiology of color, the wavelength of light, and even quantum dynamic effects. In our story, Mary is so enamored with her subject that she knows everything there is to know about vision and color. In other words, Mary knows all the information about her topic. She also knows that a new gene therapy would give her color vision, but it is costly, so she had the surgery after years of saving. When Mary awakes from her treatment and the bandages are removed, she sees red for the first time. So, the question from Frank Jackson, and in our version, is, did Mary learn something new? Remember, it is assumed that she had been given all the knowledge about the quantity of color. However, now she knows something new, the qualia of color. This experience of qualia distinguishes consciousness, and physicists cannot explain how the brain creates this flow of experience. It is the hard problem of consciousness. Furthermore, as we have seen, the information transfer that collapses the wave function only exacerbates the cognitive dissonance of the agnostic physicist. To avoid this, scientists frame the debate by referring only to the soft problem of consciousness. The soft problem of consciousness is about how things transfer information. It is simple awareness coupled with execution. So to avoid the hard problem, they never really refer to it. For example, machines can record or measure information, and when they do, the wave function collapses, even if the device was destroyed before a conscious observer can retrieve it. See, they say, consciousness has nothing to do with it. Non-conscious things can collapse the wave function, but not so fast. Any measurement method is a soft form of consciousness, because any definition of consciousness must include awareness and information processing. It does not follow that consciousness has nothing to do with the wave function collapse because the conscious observer is less advanced. Once information is possibly available for consciousness, the wave function collapses. Remember, in the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment, the wave function collapses even if a machine does not directly measure the information, but is only available by inference. The qualia of the particles conform to the inference itself. This evidence moves the debate beyond the soft problem of consciousness to the hard problem, and it is most often conveniently ignored by the woo-woo alarmists. Regardless, the physicist still cannot explain the mental nature of any transfer of information for either the soft or hard problem of consciousness, preferring to keep their invincible ignorance instead. The evidence that consciousness, and therefore mind, is fundamental subjects our poor physicist to post-traumatic stress. It is easier to avoid cognitive dissonance by saying information is physical. Was Mary's experience of red physical information? If so, how does one measure it? They cannot, of course, so they must conclude that Mary's new information is unreal. Yet they will not deny their own subjective experience. The experience of subjective reality cannot be measured as a physical quantity, and therefore is not material. If one's subjective experience is real, in the usual sense, then it proves at least a certain dualism between mind and matter. However, as we have seen with contemporary science, even the physical is not physical. Another prominent modern philosopher, Thomas Nagel, illustrated this with another thought experiment, 1974, asking, "What is it like to be a bat?" The question reveals the inherently subjective nature of consciousness because, without the experience of the qualia that only the bat perceives, one cannot know that information. So, again, it cannot be measured, and if it cannot be measured, it is not physical. The hard problem of consciousness is troubling to the agnostic physicist, since qualia cannot be quantified. Remember, materialism is a reductive philosophy where things are simply made up of other things. For example, red is really the firing of rods and cones in the retina of the eye. It reduces things by saying they are different things. Nagel argued that consciousness, both hard and soft versions, negates this presupposition. If we return to Berkeley's original argument that one cannot reach behind the ideas, or the qualia, to some material substance, the implication is that consciousness itself is primary. Further, if reality is consciousness, and the collapse of the wave function is merely one mind reading another, one could assume the larger mind is God, as Berkeley did. The larger mind, of which our minds are subsumed, is a necessary conclusion due to the perceived permanence of ideas. We leave a tree we planted and return years later to find that it has grown. We leave our house for work and return to find it where we left it. This permanence is at the heart of the physical assumption that some permanent material substance supports the things around us, that things are independent of our minds. Some try to wrangle their way back into materialism by saying that all material substances are conscious, even if in the softest of soft ways. This philosophy is called panpsychism. Panpsychism can be dismissed because it atomizes the concept of the mind, making the universe a collection of Vigintillion singular minds. In other words, it begs the question by making the mind a property of matter. Therefore, it undefines both. Regardless, this version fares no better for the agnostic physicist, whose woo-woo alarms are clinging even at its mention. Agnostic physicists prefer to kick the can down the road, saying someday someone will explain the problems. They introduce the science of the gaps and ignore philosophical questions altogether. Besides its obvious avoidance, the problem with this approach is that it may be impossible to reduce consciousness to material substance. For example, I do not think science will ever explain the subjective nature of red or elucidate what it is like to be a bat, because it is not logically possible. In the thought experiment, Mary had all the quantized information about color, but the quantities cannot, by definition, be qualities. It would be like explaining the awe of a mountain by seeing it on a map. One cannot measure the subjective nature of experience because such experiences are epistemologically different. One is objective and the other is subjective. The philosopher John Searle gave us introductory philosophy students a thought experiment in the 1980s. The story questions any potential for AI consciousness, but I believe it also attacks the physicalist position of consciousness. In his philosophical thought experiment, Searle asks his readers to imagine a man in a room with a slit in the door. The man has been given detailed instructions and algorithms about symbol manipulation. He is to respond with another set if he receives a particular set. Little does he know that the symbols are Chinese and that he is processing Chinese language and syntax. When questions are provided, he uses the instructions to process an answer and sends the results back out the door. The man appears to understand Chinese to the people outside the room because he can respond appropriately to their input. But, as you know, he doesn't understand Chinese. It is all an illusion. In the same way, consciousness and its concomitant subjective experience cannot be quantified down to functional or behavioral inputs and outputs. Consciousness is epistemologically different from mere data processing and is not subject to the materialist's behavioral or functional frameworks. A few philosophers may admit that consciousness is not reducible to physical processes, but the material world is all that matters. The physical world is a closed system. Consciousness is just an emergent process which contradicts the closed system idea, or consciousness does not influence the physical world. In other words, some will default to dualism to preserve some semblance of their materialist bias. This compromise, however, comes at the cost of explaining both, especially considering quantum mechanics and the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness is only hard for the agnostic physicist.